There we go.
All right. Well, good afternoon. My name's Phil Conrad, and I'm here with Scott Chow, who's one of the TAs for CS48 in Spring 20 here at UC Santa Barbara. And we are talking through some code from a sample project called Project Idea Reviewer Next.js. Just wanted to kind of understand a bit about this code. So I'm going to bring this up in VS Code and ask Scott to walk me through some things. So Scott, where should we start?
So I would say a good place to start would be API/admin.
All right.
Slash admins, yeah.
So let's
under pages.
do that. Let's we're here, and you can see that under pages, there's this directory called API. And let me see if I can make some more some more room here. There we go. All right. So under API, we have admins.
Yeah, admins, and then like index.js or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Okay. And yeah. So index.js. So if we look in this file, we see one of the first things is I have import authenticated action and import init database. And it looks like in both cases, those are coming from a directory called utils. And that directory is right here. So there's utils API and utils MongoDB. So this is code that was written specifically for this application. If I go back to admin, let's see, where were we? API, admins, index.js. What do I need to know about authenticated action and init database?
So the first things to know, well, those are two different questions. So init database, the objective of an init database is to give you an active connection to MongoDB. Now, let's be clear, this connection only works in the back end of your code. So it only works in files that are under pages/API. That's the first thing to know. Now, when I say it has a connection to your database, there's a kind of terminology here that we have to clarify, which is we have our backend, which is what's under API, pages/API, and then we have our database, which is MongoDB. The two are different. MongoDB is a database because it persists data. That means if you turn the power off and turn the power back on, the data is still there. Your backend, on the other hand, is constantly coming up and down potentially, right? You'll notice that you're constantly writing functions. You're not maintaining any state. There is no global state to be accessed. So your backend will first talk to MongoDB to get state, and then it will answer the question of the request. Right?
Got it. So if
that's the
to understand the stuff under pages. There's the stuff under pages that is under API and the stuff that's not under API. The stuff that's not under API, this is my React and my HTML. This is the code that's going to be in the browser. And in that part, I cannot directly talk to the database. I have to talk to the API, and the API talks to the database on my behalf. Is that right?
Exactly. That is correct. And there's one more clarification I want to add, which is when we say talk to the backend, right? I don't mean, or we don't mean call a function. Like we don't mean, for example, you cannot call get admins, right, in another file. Technically you can because it's JavaScript, right? You can just import it from another file. If you were to try to do that, however, you might get some complaints about like don't have DNS module or something like that. That's a sign that you are attempting to use code that only belongs in the back end in the front end.
Gotcha.
Right? If you want more details on why the DNS module cannot be imported in the front end, you can feel free to hit us up on Slack, but that's a much deeper discussion.
So just to clarify, even though this is written in JavaScript and this is written in JavaScript, I can't call, inside of this JavaScript function, I can't call functions that are under the API part. I instead have to use a different way of communicating between the front end and the back end. And that's that way that if I'm in the front end, that I ask a question of the back end.
So the the word, or I guess technically anagram, or I forget what you call these.
The abbreviation?
Abbreviation
Yeah,
is HTTP, or HTTP request, which
right.
stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Not that you need to know that, but the idea is basically HTTP represents a way for one process on one computer to talk to another process on another computer. Full stop, right? So the idea is basically your browser can communicate with the backend that is hosted by Heroku. So these are two different computers, right, that can talk to each other, right, via this protocol that the two have agreed to beforehand,
Sure.
called HTTP, right? And that is the way you can ask your backend to run the function get admin for you, right?
And
You're not allowed to call it directly, but
sure.
you are allowed to ask another computer that is your backend to run it for you.
And is there a way we can see that somehow in the data, or rather like in the admins JS or students JS? Like, where would I find that? Like if this is front end code, how is this
Yep.
front end code talking to the back end?
So if we scroll down a little bit, in admins JS, the file.
Yes.
So in the file you're in, scroll on down and stop right there. Scroll up just a little bit. The line I want everyone to focus on is line 45. We'll get to this later in the discussion, or maybe right now, we'll see. But this line right here is doing the fetching of admins and is retrieving the data from API/admins for us.
Got it.
We'll discuss how and why later, and also what this use SWR thing is. But just know that that's the line. If you're wondering which line of code is doing it, that's the line of code that's retrieving the data from the backend. It is calling and making an HTTP request all the way out to your backend, invoking the function on the backend, right? And then getting the data back once the backend responds.
Gotcha.
Right.
So just to clarify, under pages, I have a directory called admin and a file called admins.js. So what I would expect is if I am running this app with npm run dev, and let's see, why did that not work?
You might already be running it.
I think I am already running it. I think I have it running in, maybe not.
You might have it also something else.
Oh, there it is. It is already running. Okay, good. So it's already running in another browser window. And so if I come back up to localhost 3000, and I see I have an admin menu, and I go to manage admins, I see here in my URL, I have localhost 3000 admin admins, and that corresponds exactly to, let me just move this so we can see, though, the URL admin admins corresponds to admin admins. So this is the page.
Yep, those two precisely.
The question is, where is all this data coming from? Well, that data is coming from this line of code right here. This is the line of code that asks the backend, and it asks API admins to give us the data that we're then displaying on the page. And that takes us back to API admins index.js, because that is what corresponds to, if I go back to here for a minute and go back to line 45, this API admins is under pages, under API, under admins, and then because there's nothing else after admins, we're looking at index.js.
Exactly. Index being the kind of magic term that we use to refer to nothing specifically under admins, just admins.
Right. Got it. Okay, so this file is in the backend, and this is the code that would run, at least something in here is what runs when here on line 45, I do use SWR API admins, and I am asking, I guess somehow I'm asking for initial data and
You're not asking for initial data. You're telling it, by the way, this is my initial data.
Oh, I see.
You're just informing it. That's all.
Got it. So I'm giving it some initial data, and I get back something called data and mutate, which I guess we'll get to later.
Exactly.
But
Data is self-explanatory. Mutate we will explain later.
okay,
But
so here we are in this file. What should I be paying attention to over here?
so interestingly enough, so we've already established what a init database is doing in terms of like how it allows you to connect to MongoDB, right?
Yes.
So in terms of like actually connecting to the database, this is the first line of code, line 5, actually confirms that you have an active connection to MongoDB. And then line 6 will go ahead and focus the client on a specific collection. If you're not familiar with MongoDB, collections are similar or analogous to tables in SQL. The idea being is that it's one kind of header that you can focus on. So this focuses the client on the user's collection.
Gotcha.
And from that, we'll return the collection connection. And using that, you can now specifically query that collection as is done in line 8. Now, in terms of looking up like the exact syntax for like what methods, like we see we're using this find here, but are there other methods you can use? The MongoDB Node.js documentation is the best place to look for that, because there are 1,000,001 different small like little caveats to the find one and update find one and remove find one and insert. There's so many different versions of find that to try to explain all of them would be pointless. Just know this is that if you're looking for a specific type of find, it probably already exists, and or this first parameter that you are passing, we often call it a query in our code. What it serves as is a filter parameter. So all things that pass this filter will be accepted by this find. That is to say, currently this find command will retrieve you all users that have the role admin. Right.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. I see that what we have here is a function. It awaits init database, which I assume means wait until we have a connection to the database. It focuses on a particular collection called users. And then within that collection, it finds all the users that have the role admin, turns that into an array, and then it returns it to us. So I got that. What is this? And I remember the export function is how we make sure that we can get this function if we, if we import this whole module somewhere else, we can get that function. What's this async stuff going on? And what's the wait happening here? So
async await, or like as it's more commonly referred to, just async await, is JavaScript's not necessarily parallel programming paradigm, but it's paradigm for allowing multiple things to occur at the same time. The idea being is that every function that calls await must be async. So if there's an async anywhere in the body of your function now must be declared async. Or if there's an await anywhere in your body, you must now be declared async. So if you were to somehow remove this await, then you would be allowed to remove this async, right? But you cannot have a function that has an await and not be asynchronous. Now, that's like the first like nuts and bolts like language syntax. An asynchronous function, by definition, returns something called a promise, right? A promise you can think of as a bubble around your around an eventual value, right? To give you context for why you might have this, right? Suppose you need to spend 10 minutes like to call a function to like go through and trawl like the Library of Congress or something, right? Suppose we just say it takes 10 minutes for this function to run, right? You would not like your program to freeze during those 10 minutes. You would like your computer to do other things, right? Potentially your program to do other things. So what you do is you declare that this function is going to be asynchronous because it is going to take a while, right? There's a myriad of other reasons, but this is the most common one. So the reason we have promises is basically, we would like to be able to pass around this potential or eventual value, right? This value that may or may not exist yet, and use that in other functions, right? Because maybe we don't need to know the value yet to do something else, but we just need to know that you've asked for the value, right? In order to do something else. Now, to back it up and like re-simplify.
Right. So a promise is a value that we'll have eventually. We don't have it yet necessarily, but eventually
Precisely.
we will.
Exactly. The best example, so an example of a promise right now, it would just be if you don't ignore a wait, and I want to emphasize, if you ignore a wait, init database currently returns a promise, right?
Got
It returns the promise of a database connection, right?
Yes.
Now, the reason I'm stressing you need to ignore a wait is because a wait's job is to unwrap a promise or force your program to pause this thread of execution until it can unwrap that promise.
Got it.
Right? So this is a synchronization primitive for those people who know what that means. If you don't worry about it. It sounds exactly like it is. It's a way to synchronize things in your program.
A database would return a promise, but a wait says,
exactly.
Yeah, promise isn't good enough. I want you to deliver on the promise before we're moving.
I either want you to deliver on the promise or you're going to throw an exception before I let you through.
Got it.
Those are the two ways of escaping an await, right? Is either you resolve to a value or you throw an exception.
Got it.
Right?
Okay.
So that forces everything after, from line 6 to line 8, right, to be done after after a init, or sorry, I highlighted the wrong thing. Everything line 6 to line 8 will be done after await unwraps a init database, right?
Gotcha.
Now,
I think I've got like these lines here.
Exactly.
But where does getAdmins get called or used, and how does that get the data back to my front end?
So if we scroll all the way to the bottom of this, so if we look here inside of perform action for the moment, right? So we will notice here that it gets called right here on line 52. Now,
okay.
What this basically, so if you read the function, right? The function does the following. It takes a request and a user. It checks if the user is an admin. If they're not an admin, it throws them out, right? Otherwise, it'll attempt to check the method, the HTTP method of the request. Now, those HTTP things we talked about before, there are different flavors of them. The two we care about most of all are get and post. So what it does is it just checks, is it the get flavor? Okay, cool, then call this function. Otherwise, is it a post flavor? Okay, fine, call this function. Is it none of the above? Throw.
Got it. So just to pause for a minute, this 403 and this 405, those are HTTP status codes. And the most famous one is 404.
Bingo.
You know, so you know, you actually, it's so well known, it's a Halloween costume. 404, file not found, right? 404, file not found is what you see when you go to a web page and it's like, nope, it's not there. But 404 is just one of many status codes. 403 and 405 are other kinds of errors. And off the top of my head, 403 might be forbidden. Is that what it is?
403 should be, forbidden. So basically, I know who you are, but you're not allowed to do that.
Right. And 405, I'm guessing, is something like, you're not doing it the right way.
Method not allowed is precisely,
What is it called?
It's method not allowed.
Method not allowed.
Which is different than not found.
Got it.
You're not allowed to do that.
Gotcha. So get is allowed, post is allowed, anything else is a method not allowed. So that's what the status 405 and the status 403 are really doing. And what we're really saying is that this route here, which is under API admins, there's really two things we expect. We expect either a get, in which case we're going to give you all the admins, or we expect a post, in which case the request data must have something in it that allows us to create an admin, which is probably like an email address, because that's what we use to create an admin.
Precisely.
If we look back over at this page, there is the email address where I could type in an admin like user@example.org. And if I click the add admin button, what I assume is going to happen is a post message, which is going to result in this create admin function getting called.
Yep.
And I would assume that that request somehow contains this user@example.org that I put in.
Exactly. And I can even prove it to you. If you go back to your Google Chrome instance,
Uh-huh.
if you go back to your web browser,
Yep.
if you right click anything in your page,
Yep.
and you go down to inspect, right? This will open the developer console in almost every single web browser. Now the tab, which also almost every single web browser will have, is called the network tab, right? If you click on that, and refresh the page and go through that flow again, you will actually notice that there will be a post request that it records.
So let me try adding foobar@example.org as an admin here. And if I click add admin, then what we see down here is, oops. Where should I click?
So we have 3 different calls to admins, right?
Right.
One of these will be a post, right? So I suspect it's the middle one. The first one was probably called by revalidate. And there we go, right? We will see, and you can actually click on headers to verify what it actually is.
Yep,
and we see that it's a post request, right?
Yep.
So this post request, if you look in the preview again, right, has the body of an email. And this is, I should clarify, this is the response, right? So if we want to look at what we actually sent, we go back to headers and we go all the way down to the bottom. And we see all the way at the bottom, we see that this is what we sent. We only sent them the email.
And,
right? And we sent it in a JSON object.
And this here, this email foobar@example.org, if we go back to the code, that is what's going to come into this REQ right here, yes?
Precisely.
And we should see, if I go into create admin,
which I believe is just above,
we actually unwrap it right here by going const email equals req.body, and there it is.
Precisely. There it is. So that explains at a high level like how this request eventually gets here. But there's kind of one snag you'll realize, which is at the bottom of the file, you'll realize that the default export, which if you're familiar with Next.js, this is the only method that matters. The export default is not perform action. In fact, it's perform action passed to another method called authenticated action. And this is where our app's infrastructure diverges from the most plain version of Next.js's backend infrastructure.
So my understanding is that authenticated action is something that Brian Terse wrote in this app to make it simpler for us to authenticate the different actions and make sure that that the user is permitted to perform the action that they're trying to perform.
Precisely. And I think the best way to kind of highlight the difference is to actually go and find what the original, what an original version of the Next.js backend would look like. So if we can go to your web browser, and if we can go to nextjs.org /learn.
Nextjs.org/learn, or
probably, yeah, or you can click on, exactly. And if you were to go down to API routes here.
Right here.
Yes. So if we click over Start Now, and we click Next, because this is all set up at the moment. So this right here, I think, is like the single simplest explanation of what the backend should look like, right? You export a default function that takes a request and response. Using the request, you figure out how to mutate this response. Now I say mutate, not return, mutate. Or change the response object such that it represents the response you would like to send the user. And then the function returns and it responds with the response that you've mutated. Now, if we scroll down to the bottom, or more towards the bottom, we see here example, right? This is an example of how you use and modify the response object, right? You set the status to 200 and you set its JSON body to be text hello.
And 200 is the status for a successful response. We talked about
successful response with a
being
body.
Found, and 403 being not authorized, and 405 being method not allowed. 200 is, okay, it worked.
Precisely.
So we need to set the status to 200 anytime we want something to succeed.
Yeah, or to be considered a success.
Right.
There are caveats to that, but we're not going to get into them now. So if this is what a typical Next.js backend is supposed to look like, you might be asking yourself, well, isn't that different than what we just did, right? Because what we just did was we took a request and a user and returned a response body. We did nothing in the status codes, right? We only threw status codes if they weren't 200s, right? And you might be very confused right now and saying, like, well, how does this square with the documentation? And the answer is authenticated action changes the contract. So right now in Next.js documentation, so forget our app at the moment, just this, just Next.js. The contract is thus. I give you a request and response. You can use the request to do whatever you need to find out whatever information you need from the user, and you will modify the response such that it represents your response to the user. That is the contract, right? We have changed this contract in authenticated action to be instead, you will receive a request and a user, you will throw if you have an error, and finally, you will return the body of your response if there is one. That is the fundamental shift that authenticated action introduces. Now, the reason I am explaining this beforehand is because you're going to see a couple scary things when we open up that function. And I want you to hold on to the fact that all we're doing is changing the contract, right? So let's go ahead and pop open authenticated action.
Okay, which is down under utils, and it's in, I believe, API. Got it.
Okay,
and here it is.
So let me
it's the only
clear my
function
drawings.
in that API.js file.
Exactly. So if we can go ahead and actually make this like full screen.
Sure.
Just so.
Probably easiest to do it that way.
Exactly. So now, a lot of scary things here, but we're going to walk through this line by line. So first thing is we're just exporting this function. It's a function called authenticated action that takes something called an action function. Now, in JavaScript, like many modern languages, you can pass functions around as a first order object, as a first order primitive, as it were, right? Which means you can put functions into variables. This sounds really weird at first, but trust me, it's no different than you would ever use. It's not too different from anything you've ever done. It's just now, yeah.
So just to jump in, the parameter here, action function, we can see that whatever else may be going on, right here on line 10, that looks like a function call because it is a function call.
Precisely, it is a function call.
Is whatever we passed in, and in the case of the code we were looking at a moment ago, which is this code right here, it's the perform action function. That's what's getting passed in. And so this function right here is what's getting called.
And it takes a request and a user.
Yep.
Right. So if we go back to the code that we were just looking at.
The code for
APIs.js.
Yep, here we are.
We will notice here that we pass any action function a request and a user.
Yes.
Right? So remember what I said before, which is authenticated action's job is to change the contract. It still needs to fulfill the original contract. So it's inserting itself in between, right?
Yep.
If we have, Next.js, like if I go ahead and use your screen and draw real quick, let's see if I can pick a slightly more visible color, right? So Next.js, right, is expecting to input, right, request and response object, right, into this black box, which is your backend, right? It'll go ahead and select the correct file, but any more than that, it doesn't know what's going on, right? And expects on the other end for response to be modified, right? So I'm going to use this star notation, right, to say response is modified, right? So typically, if you just implement the function as is given in the documentation, this is one-to-one, right? Authenticated action, however, is introducing a box within the box, right? And I'm going to go ahead and clear this drawing. But now we have the box right here, which is the Next.js box, right? Which gives you the request and the response. And you now get to declare authenticated action, right? Which is this box inside. It's going to return the body of the response, should it have one, right? And this is actually the fundamental difference. And actually, I should say, it gives in a request and a user to authenticated action. And I'll just call this auth here, right? But this is what I mean by it's changing the contract. It still has to fulfill the original one, right? So it still must be that I give a request and a user out, or request and response out here, and I get a modified response at the end. But if I introduce a layer in between that kind of like shuffles things around for us, it means everything that uses authenticated action can have a different contract instead, right? That's a high level explanation, right? So now we'll actually get into the nitty gritty of like, how does it fulfill the original contract, and how does it change the contract it gives to other functions, right? So what we want to start with is line 5. We've done line 4, we're going to do line 5. Auth0 require authentication, right? Auth0 require authentication. This is something that comes from Auth0, right? Or our wrapper around Auth0. So if we go ahead and click there.
So click on Auth0.
Yeah, if you like command click, I think that will navigate you. Or sorry, you're gonna have to do.
There we go.
Yeah, precisely. There we go. So init auth0, right, is the default export, and what this is a bunch. It's an object. It's a call to init auth0, which is the auth0 Next.js library. That's just a library thing, right? And you are initializing this library with all your secrets. Right, so auth0 knows like who you are and what app you're talking about and all this sort of good stuff, right? That's what this file is concerned with. So if we go back up, if we back to the go back to the file.
All of these things are coming from config.
Bingo.
Is at the top level, I think, of our code, or actually, it's
in utils.
It's within utils.
Yep.
Still within utils. And this is just getting all of the secrets from where they need to be. So if at some point you're adding like another secret, you might need to change. You might need to add it in this module as well. But let's get back to auth0.
So auth0 is initializing the library to auth0. It's initializing what the correct terms to say would be. It is initializing the auth0 client. The client being the actual object you use to interact with auth0, right? So if we go back to the api.js,
yep,
right, we'll notice that so the auth0 client that we get here has a function which says require authentication. This is auth0's library right now, right? So we are working within the bounds of auth0 right now. And what we pass to it is, I'm sorry, but it's another function. In this case, we declare it an async function, right? Because we're going to have some awaits in here. And what we pass to it is what we expect, which is basically, we expect a request and response, right? And at the end, the response should be modified in such a way such that, you know, the response reflects the response I'm going to send back to the user. This is in the documentation still, right? It's just we are wrapping this function inside of auth0 require authentication. And all of that setup, right? The reason that we need the auth0 require authentication is just to allow us to retrieve this auth0 session right here. Right? Because if we don't wrap this inside of auth0's require authentication, we don't have a sense of the session, right? At a high level. We can get into deeper level discussions of like what needs to be where at a different time, but like the high level is we need all of this preamble on line 5 just so we can call this thing on line 7, right? And we notice
the user object.
Precisely. That is how we tell auth0, given this request, right? Can you get me the user out of it? Can you extract out of it the user?
Got it.
Right? Which is why we need to funnel it through auth0's require authentication.
Because the user will be part of this request object, but we need auth0's help to get that user from the request object.
Precisely. And this discussion is not focusing on the internals of auth0. Right. But the idea is that if you would like to retrieve the session, you're going to need to first require authentication, right? Because you won't have a session otherwise. So we'll leave that discussion for potentially another video or another discussion in class, but let's move on. So now we've established that we have a user object, right? All of that work to just get a user object, I know. And then we're going to go ahead and call yet another function that we've declared, which is attach user metadata. So if we go ahead and go to attach user metadata on line 2.
So command click?
Yeah, you can command click that as well.
Okay. And
we'll see that this is another,
now.
So this is another util file. So not a library, we've written this ourselves. Its entire goal is, if we read this, we get a client connection to the database, we go to the user's collection, and then we check, is the user there, right? If the user is there, which is this if result, because if the user's not there, we'll get empty, right? If the result exists, then we're going to set this user object, right? The ID of it to be the MongoDB ID. And we're going to set the role to be the one in the database. Otherwise, we'll set it to guest.
Gotcha.
So all of this attached user metadata is only to just square away auth0's concept of the user with what we have in the database of MongoDB, right? Because the two, MongoDB and auth0, don't really know each other. Right? So that's what we have to like converge, is the auth0 sense of a user and a MongoDB understanding of a user. So we're just taking set sum of
gotcha.
their property.
So any application that has multiple roles for its users might need to do something like this.
Yes, especially if those roles are not directly managed by auth0.
Right. If you have your own database where you decide who's an admin and who's a this kind of user, who's a that kind of user.
Or even if users have properties of their own, like number of posts made, right? Auth0 will not understand that, right? Because its sole purpose, auth0's sole purpose is to just authenticate you and give you all of the information that you have given the app permission to give, right? From like Google or Facebook or whatever, right? It doesn't know anything about your app or what your app has data associated with each user. So this is attaching the user metadata. It's attaching data about the user to the user object.
Got it. So the big picture again, we have a request and a response, and we're kind of adapting that standard contract to the one that is this authenticated action one. First thing we do is we go out and we get the user information based on auth0, based on who's logged in or not. Second thing we do is we go out to our own database and get what we know about the user. And then we're actually going to call the function. This is where we call, this is where we adapt and say, okay, instead of a request and a response, your function's going to take a request and a user. And what we're going to return back is this action result.
Precisely. That is exactly that. I would say that's a very accurate explanation of what we've done up until this point. The nice thing to note is that everything we've done so far is in a try-catch block.
Yes.
So if anything we've done so far were to fail, right? And anything at this point, right? Like get session could have failed. Attach user metadata could have failed, right? The action function could have failed. If it were to fail, right, we would jump out and run the catch block, right? This is, you know, every function, every language that supports exceptions, which I believe is most, if not all, has this try catch concept. And then it'll console.log the error, so we have it in the backend logs, and then it will return a response of either the specific error status as thrown by the error or 500, and it will put in the body either the error message or it will attempt it will the error message, and it will stringify the JSON. So it'll add those two things into the error body and then send it off. So that's what's good to know about all of this extra. Like that's why it's in a try catch block. That's why we have this catch block that's also doing all of these things. But if everything is working, if everything is going right, we get the return, we get the result of the action result. We set the status code to either be 200 if the action result is not empty, or 204 if there's no body. I said there were caveats. This is a caveat. And then we're doing response.end, JSON stringify, action result, right? And that's how we satisfy the original contract.
Got it.
We took a request and response. We did whatever we needed to. We called whatever methods we needed to get the information about that action. And then we took all the data about the run of that action, and we just said, okay, here we go. We put it all into a response. We summarize everything that happened, and then boom, we send it back.
So it sounds like the big picture, if we go back to where we started, which is here under API index.js. This is an authenticated action because in our original app, if I can go back to my browser and find the running app, this, and let me get rid of this for a minute. This admin menu should only appear, it should only work if we're logged in. If I log out, the admin menu isn't even there. And if I go to admins/admin, actually I think it's admins/admin, or is it the other way around?
I honestly don't remember.
Well,
also, as a fun fact, this is called forceful browsing.
Say again?
This is called forceful browsing.
Forceful
there is no
browsing.
button or link that links you to this, but you browse to it anyways.
Yes. So admin, or admins, either one of those. Okay. So I tried to do it, and it's forcing me to log in because it knows I should not be going there if I'm not logged in.
Precisely.
And
this is on it. And now that I think about it, this might actually be the reason you have to wrap it in the require authenticated.
Right.
So if we go back to the code real quick, actually, I think I might have been wrong before. If we go to the code, if we go to authenticated action.
Authenticated action, yes, which is under utils and
API.
Yes, okay.
This require authentication, right?
Yes.
From auth0 will automatically bounce. It will redirect or it will send a redirect request and redirect you to log in. That's what it does. My bad. It doesn't actually, because you could call all this stuff otherwise, right? But this will automatically bounce the user to the login screen.
So to review, we were under admins, API. I'm sorry, not API. We were under pages, admins. When I did admin, I got a 404 not found. When I did admins, and I wasn't logged in, it forced me to log in because it's like, you can't go to that page if you're not logged in.
Exactly.
So
and that's
when I'm logged in as an admin and I go to admins, I see the page.
Precisely.
But if I were to log out and log in as a not admin, hopefully this account is a not admin. And yeah, I'm logging in here for the first time. And I don't see it on the menu. But if I were to well, dude, I'm going to go there anyway. It's like, oh no, you're not. It's like I go there and then boom, it's like, nope, you are not going there today.
Precisely.
And that is a consequence of the fact that on this page over here, admins, something on here is basically saying like, yeah, if you're not an admin, you cannot be on this page. So what is
I believe
that?
if you
How
scroll
is that
up,
working?
so let's go ahead and start by scrolling up first off.
Okay,
Let's see. Oh, sorry, scroll down. I meant at the top of the React function.
gotcha.
Let's see here, add admin. Okay, so we get the user, we attempt to get the data, then mutate. So if we scroll a little bit down, if you can go ahead and collapse, sorry, stop scrolling for a moment. And then if we could go ahead and collapse these functions by clicking the little carrots. Or actually, yeah, if you can click the ones, yeah, at the top level, that would be great.
Like here?
Or, no, yeah, that'll collapse the entire function, but just collapse like for each, yeah, so let's start with this one, just so it's a little bit easier to read. So const add admin does a bunch of stuff, delete admin does a bunch of stuff. Yeah, close that one as well, close this one as well. Let's see. So layout user, so the only thing we pass user to is actually the layout.
Yes.
So if we go to layout, because nothing here, none of the code there, to be clear, none of the code we saw there would bounce you.
Right.
Inherently, right? It would error out. It might not load the data, but it wouldn't bounce you. So we go into layout and we say, okay, what actually depends on user in this case? Well, app navbar does.
Yes.
In this case, I don't think app navbar is going to redirect you though.
I don't think so.
Although it does seem to do role checking.
It does.
But that's only
for which.
But yeah, which links to show.
I wonder if the page, when it's trying to render the data, so if we go back to
admins,
I wonder if somewhere down in trying to render the data, which would be, let's see, this is the form for adding a new admin.
It would be here, the bootstrap table.
Yeah, somewhere down in here, I have totally lost my cursor.
That's interesting because I can see your cursor.
Where is it?
It's towards the
top I found
right.
It. Okay, I found the cursor. Okay. Good, good. All right, let me go back to VS Code. Good, cursor came back. So I wonder if down here, when it's rendering the bootstrap table and it tries to get the table, if there's an error, and maybe when it traps the error, it just redirects to the home page?
I would hesitate to come to that conclusion because how would you load an empty table?
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Well, let's just say that
hold up,
right now,
hold up. Hold up. You actually paused on the perfect point.
Okay.
Right here. Well, we'll come back to that question. I need to actually do a little bit of research.
Oh, maybe it's this though. The crack that this get server side props, await create required auth roles, admin, request response. Maybe there's something going on there.
Could potentially be something like this.
But we'll just note that for the time being, we are not entirely sure why, when I am not logged in as an admin and I go to admins, somehow it redirects me to the home page, which is good because I shouldn't be able to get to that page. Exactly how that's happening, whether that's happening as a result of the code in the front end for that component, or whether it's resulting in because of the code in the back end, we're not sure, but it does happen. On the other hand, when I am an admin, so let me log back in as an admin. So now that I am an admin, first of all, the fact that it shows up on the menu bar at all is because since we went there, let's go ahead and point that out. That is because of the code here in app navbar, where down here it says, well, what is my user role? And if my user role is triple equals, which is the JavaScript way of saying, are these the same? If it's admin, then, and by the way, this user role triple equals admin and is just kind of a clever way of saying if, because the and, you may remember from your earlier 16, 24, 32 courses, does short circuit evaluation. If this is false, then it doesn't even need to evaluate the second part of this. But if this is true, then it does evaluate the second part of this. So if this is true, then all of this will happen. So it's like an if. It's like saying, well, if we're an admin, then we're going to put these links up there, the links to ideas, manage admins, and manage students. So I see that. I go to the admins page. That admins page is here. This is the front end code. And this code is the code that communicates with, and where was that, where did we say that that was happening? Was it the code
back
here that pulls the data from the back end?
Oh, if you scroll down, the use SWR.
Right?
Yep.
Use SWR. So this is the code that's pulling the data from the back end. And that data from the back end is coming from here. Is there anything more, Scott, that we should say, or is this a good place to wrap it up for this video?
Let's see, we've covered, yeah, I believe we've covered most, if not all the points that, or we've attempted to cover all of, if not most, if not all of the points that we wanted to cover. So yeah, I think this is probably a good place to end it.
Okay.
I might be very close to a lead on why we're not logging in, but
well, if we find
logging in will bounce you.
Yeah, yep. We'll add another video. So what we're mainly focusing on here is, in this video, is under utils, under API, we have this thing called authenticated action. And you will see in the project idea reviewer Next.js project, under API, many of the functions at the bottom do this export default authenticated action. And when you see that, how do you reconcile that with what you might be seeing in the Next.js documentation about how to write functions that go under API? So hope this was helpful.
There's actually, there's one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
One more thing, which is use SWR. Use SWR. You can look it up. SWR is a well-known package. It has great documentation on its GitHub. However, you're going to notice that if you look at the documentation alone, there's going to be slight differences with what we do in our application. And the best way to explain this is basically if we go to _app.js, we'll notice that we have this very important thing right here called SWR config. This in the documentation is referred to as a global configuration. Just so you know, because if you attempt to set up SWR and you don't know about this, you're going to be very confused looking at this code alone and being like, wait, where's this fetcher command that we're supposed to pass to it? We'll leave it there for the moment because SWR is an entire discussion unto itself. But if you're just trying to follow the documentation and just cookbook your way through, then keep in mind that you're going to need this.
All right, sounds good. And I think that is probably worth mentioning in a separate video. But let's pause it for here. Scott, thank you for your time and for walking through this explanation with me.
Yeah, thank you.
And CS48 students, if you have any questions about anything we've covered in the video, let me encourage you to post those on the Slack. It's helpful if you can make reference to the timestamp in the video. So you know, what's the minutes and seconds in the video where you know, that you're asking about, and that'll help us find that spot in the video and put your question in context. So thanks for watching.